My name's Kenneth. I am a full stack software developer um, at a company called Brico. And I write financial software, but in my spare time, I've been helping the library and kind of doing this class where we try to learn to code. And this session, we're going to be continuing from where we left off, learning some JavaScript. As we're learning some introductory JavaScript, we're learning about how to use it and some of the kind of like key features of it. And hopefully I'll introduce you to some of them, and you'll maybe be inspired to learn more, or join my office hours on Mondays from 6:30 to 8:30. I can answer any questions you might have. So last week we were using kind of like an interactive tool in the browser. So right now I'm in my browser, I'm using Firefox. And we were using a tool like a code editor that would let us sort of write our code using this web page, and then it will display the results of our code for us. So this tool is really useful for doing like what's called prototyping, where you want to create some quick content or quick code to just edit on the fly and kind of figure out if it's going to work for you. But it's also just really a convenient way to like learn. So we're going to use this. It's called Codepen Io. If you go here for the first time, it should say something on the left-hand side. I can try to prompt that to just point at where it's going to want you to go. So if you just click like start coding, you won't have to sign in or anything like that. And so what I've done is I've just added a few lines of code here to get us back where we left off last time. So I haven't done very much. And I've added some JavaScript here on the right, including a couple of the things that we talked about. So we talked about variables, we talked about the console API. If there's anything that kind of like seems confusing, I'm be happy to explain it. And Celeste, who's helping out with the library, she'll hopefully chime in if anyone has questions, and I'll try to answer those. But first thing we're going to do, aside from if you want to follow along, you want to add these lines of code with your own name. I'm going to hide this because we're not going to do any CSS. We're just going to be doing JavaScript and HTML. So I don't need to see this window. So I wish I could actually just make it go away. But, oh wait, can I? This is, yeah, we can just, we'll just hide it like that. Okay, so going from where we left off, we talked about the different kinds of variables, and we talked about how to use them in some of our code. So if we take a look at this starter JavaScript code here, I've set up a variable called my name using the keyword let. So I'm saying let my name be Kenneth. And I'm actually printing the word Kenneth here in the console. We can look at the output of the console here. You can see it's produced my name several times here in the console. That's because every time you make a change to the code, it will sort of like refresh the page that you sort of like have like prototyped here. So in our case, we like changed this HTML and then we just made this edit, but we've removed it. And so you'll see it'll print again because this JavaScript runs one time on page load. So you can imagine this kind of like how if you visit somewhere like Google, you see the Google bar kind of pop up. If I could get this out of the way, let's see. So if we go to Google right now, You see this Google bar pop up, like it just does it the one time. So that's on page load. And every time we load the page, it's going to reload that like web bar. So it's kind of the same concept, right? This code is only going to run one time. And we'll have to learn something new to have that code run whenever we want. But the first thing I want to do is point out these comments. We talked a little bit about comments last time, but again, comments are just a way of writing text in a code file that basically writing text in a code file that doesn't run as code. So like this is not going to be interpreted as JavaScript. So, it can be, a bunch of, kind of like garbage, and it won't affect the execution. So you see here, we didn't get any errors. If I were to put that kind of thing in here, right, like this doesn't make any sense. So I got this error. In this case, it didn't know what console ASDF was. But if I were to put that in a comment like I have here, it's not going to worry about it. So that's why comments are useful to kind of reiterate. But what I wanted to note here in this comment, right, is like maybe we could replace this where I've just explicitly written my name again with a variable. So that's kind of like one improvement we could go ahead and make to our little application, if you could even call it that right now. So all this application does is it has some HTML, and then it prints my name when the page loads just the one time. And you can see it still printed my name here, Kenneth, because it got it from this variable. So maybe, we can go ahead and remove this comment since we're now certain that we want to use a variable. And then we can go ahead and address this comment that I added up here to kind of refresh another lesson of the different types of variable keywords when you're sort of setting up a variable. So the three types that you'll most commonly run into is a var, which we could say another name for, and we could say, Bob, something like that. And then we can say const. We'll say also my name. We can name these variables whatever we want. And we can also give them the same value, right? I can say the same value 3 times. There's no problem with doing this. The difference between var and let is a little more complicated, but it has a lot to do with where you'll be able to use or reference this variable. So since we're all inside of the same sort of series of executions here, or like lines of JavaScript code all in this one file, we can reference my name, and we can reference all of these, actually. Another name, we can just print them again. But potentially, if you had multiple files, multiple different JavaScript files being loaded for the same page, if I were trying to reference my name, this variable, from another file, I wouldn't be able to do that because just when I use this let keyword, it's only going to be visible to the JavaScript in this same file. It's not super important right now from an introductory perspective. I just like to keep things consistent early on. And then once you start incorporating more complex JavaScript, more complicated code, you can kind of worry about that. But one that's useful right now is this const keyword, which just refers to constant. So a constant is basically a variable that you don't expect to change and you don't want to change. So in this case, I might ask myself, like, the word Kenneth here is just a convenience for referring to my name as a string. And we talked a little bit about, last time why we might want to do that. Maybe we don't want to keep having to type out Kenneth, but we could reduce this to like a very short variable name. Or maybe later on we expect that the word Kenneth will change. Maybe it'll become something even longer. So if I kept this as just a string and I wanted to use it again later, right, I would then have to type out again, right? But instead of having to do that, I can just keep referring to the letter A or the variable A instead. And that works just as well. So I'm actually going to swap this let out for a constant. So, and we'll just make a note. We'll say constant doesn't change, will always be Kenneth, unless we change the text here. And I'll just call it my name for consistency's sake. So we shouldn't have any, well, we'll still have this error because A is gone. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And now we shouldn't have any errors, and it should just print Kenneth. So now we're kind of like back to the beginning, but just refreshing some concepts before we move on. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to introduce is something we're actually already using in this example. And so far in this example, we're doing things sequentially in execution. Like I mentioned, whenever this page loads, it's going to reload the same content, and it's only going to run the one time. So I'll change it. That'll prompt it to refresh the editor. I'll add a comment. And like I said before, the code will execute again, and it'll print my name again. We could potentially create an opportunity for reusing this part of execution. So let's say, for example, what if I wanted to like print, what if I wanted to like print a couple things after this? Maybe I want to say, something like, this is my name. So I have just like another phrase following my name. And then I could say, what is yours? I don't know, something like this, a series of statements. If I wanted to do this again with a different name, and let's just say this is a name, what is yours? If I wanted to do this again with a different name, well, logically I might think, okay, I'll press copy, and I'll go down here and I'll paste it. It'll give me an error because I've already made a variable called my name. So it's going to complain about that. So I'll need to rename it. And I can't just change this text here. So if I use a name like Alex, for example, it's still going to complain because I still have this reference to my name. So we'll say another name. And that should fix our error. And we're still printing out Kenneth here on this second one. So we'll go ahead and change this to another name. And then we'll see what the update is. So we should get, two groups of printed statements. Kenneth, this is a name, what is yours? And then we get it again for our new name. So we could do this for however many names we want to print in this case. So if we want to print more names, we could simply print. Oh, I think someone was trying to join. Okay. So if we wanted to have a series of names like this printed, we could keep copying and pasting until we get all the names we want. But you might see that this is, first of all, kind of inefficient in terms of the work that we have to do. But also it requires that we duplicate a lot of code. So a lot of this code, right, like is exactly the same. There's no difference, as it were, compared to the lines above. So we can use something that JavaScript kind of like provides for us, which is it's kind of like a convenient tool for expressing functionality that we want to reference again, or we want to like repeat. And it's called a function. So I'm going to create a function now, and I'm going to try to encapsulate or like contain the behavior that is expressed on these 3 lines of code. And I'm going to try to use the function again and again in a very like clear and concise way, so that it's easier for us to read and it's easier for us to write as coders. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a new line here, and we can leave this stuff above. You know, it doesn't really hamper us or anything like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this keyword. Keyword is function, and then I'm going to give my function a name. I'm going to call it print a name. Oh, it's a bad name. Bad name because of the casing, but how about we just call it print name? Okay, and we're going to use these parentheses, which we'll see in a little bit what those do. And
Can I
we're
ask
going to
you
use
a quick question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So after you have console, that's a variable, right? So like in, for instance, line 9, it's console.log.
Sure, yeah.
Console is the variable?
Yeah, I think I kind of glossed over this, but I'm glad you brought it up because I did mean to address it just very quickly. But I didn't really talk about it as much last time either, so I think that's a good question. So when we use this keyword console, you can kind of think of that keyword similarly to like this keyword const here, or this keyword function here that we're about to use. So console is what's called a web API. So it's part of the web browser, like Firefox lets you use a console when you're using JavaScript. So does Google Chrome, so does Safari or Internet Explorer. So when you write your JavaScript code for the browser, you have like access to this keyword console. Console is like a variable, like you said, it's like a special variable. It's kind of like a tool that has a variety of functions, which we're about to sort of like dig into to see sort of like what functions are capable of doing. And one of those functions is log. So the objective of this log function, which belongs to console,
so
is
log is the function of console?
Yeah, log is what's called a member function or a method of console. That's correct.
Okay, and so just like to continue like on the syntax, it's like, so console is an API. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much, yes. Yeah.
And then log is the function of that API.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the parentheses, that is the message, or like what is?
Yeah, exactly. This is like the content that we want the console to produce. So this is our console here. The naming is helpful because we can see, you know, there's obviously a relationship here, but this is more of like a generic console, and this is the name that we're using to refer to it for JavaScript. But just to be clear, you know, in some languages there might not be a reference to console, just to be clear. But yeah, so this message that we pass, right, is getting produced, you know, immediately inside of this console here. And in fact, just like a little tip, if I go in here, what I'm doing now is I just pressed F12. So I get a similar console, and I can get that on any web page. These are developer tools. And I can actually use that same JavaScript right here. And I can say console.log, and I can say hello world. And I'll get the same behavior. So that's for any browser. And any browser should support console, and by extension log, and it will kind of like know what to do. So that is kind of like inherently a part of JavaScript, but it's really a part of the browser's tools for using JavaScript, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, so I think it does. I mean, it's like it answers it in that it opens up many other questions,
Yeah.
but it's a good thing.
Okay, well, hopefully when we write this function below, maybe that will kind of like illuminate some things, because you're correct in saying, yeah, log itself is a function. We just hadn't really talked about functions yet, but log is still super useful to just produce text or output. So it's a nice thing to like learn about first, so that you can have a quick way to print things out or see the values of variables. For example, like in this case, I'm looking at a value of a variable. It might be useful if you wanted to like use this variable instead of being a string. This is called a string, by the way. Kenneth, in this case, is a string. So it's a string of characters. We could instead say something like calculation. And I could say 2, 4 plus 8. And then I could console.log this calculation. And if I scroll back up, it'll print the calculation result. So you can see it gets pretty useful very quickly, which is why I like to introduce it so early. But what we'll do next is kind of inspect like what is actually going on when we use a function, what is possible, what can actually happen. So since you address it, it'll be a little bit interesting, but what I want to do is actually take these function usages, so these log functions, what we'd call them calls. So this is a function call. We are calling the log function with this parameter or argument, or this input. So this is the input to our function log. Similarly, we're going to have an input to our function. In our case, we want to print a name. So we can imagine that the input will probably be something like name. When I make an input here, what I'm saying essentially is like in the following code that is inside of these braces here, I can reference a variable called name. And name could be anything, but we know that it's the input to our function print name.
Is name and another name and print name, these things that are in blue, are those are the variables? Like, why is it blue? I mean, it's obvious that it's some sort of other thing because it's color coded differently.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, they chose blue. Sometimes when you edit JavaScript, if you're using what's called like an integrated development environment, or you might have heard like IDE, but also text editor or whatever. Different editors, different environments will choose to highlight things differently. So in some cases, an editor might actually highlight a variable and a function name uniquely, like they'll highlight them with different colors. But in this case, they're kind of treating them with the same color coding, and that's okay. But yeah, in this case, this is a function name. So this is the way that we're going to reference our function, similar to console.log. Somewhere, inside the browser, someone has written a function called log, and they've associated it with console. But you'd have something very similar to how this looks right here. So you'd have the word instead, you'd have log, and they would have an input to that function called log. So in our case, we have our own function called print name, and then this is a variable which doesn't occur at all up here. So this is the first time I'm using the variable name, and it only applies to our function. in this case. So basically the lines of code following here. So I can use name. Right here, I cannot use name. So I'll even try to refer to name. Nope. It actually doesn't care if I just type it out. Oh, that's, well, that's something I'm not going to get into today, but this website has decided to use the keyword name, the variable name, as like a global. It's really, God, that's called a collision, when you essentially refer to a variable that like already exists. So we got very unlucky there. Let's get a little more specific so that we don't have to like worry about that. I'll say an input name. Okay. Now if I do this, this should be undefined, and it is. So we're outside of the function right now. You know, this is called a function definition. The function will do everything inside of it between these curly braces here, and we can use an input name, right? But once we get outside of that, we can't use that anymore. Similarly, if I try to use it above, it should throw the same error, right? An input name is not defined, so it doesn't know what that is, and that makes sense. So in this case, we now have an input to our function print name. And let's go ahead and try to reproduce the behavior that we want to kind of put into this function. Let's try to grab it. So I'm just going to cut this. I'm going to cut this code, and I'm going to put it into my function. You'll see me doing like indentation and spacing. You don't necessarily have to do that. I think I talked about that last time as well. In JavaScript, it doesn't matter. This is just as valid, where I have no spaces here, as doing this. I just like the way that this looks a little bit better. I think it is easier to read. It shows that this code is like part of the definition of this function. So this code is what this function is going to do. So when I use this function later, this function is going to do the exact same things that you saw me doing right here. And in fact, you can still see me doing that. So if you'll notice, what's going to happen is, you know, this code right here, it's actually nothing will happen. This code is not going to execute. The reason is because we've wrapped it in a function, but we haven't used that function yet. So if I add a comment here just to get it to change, so here, you know, just an arbitrary comment, you'll notice, and it did it twice because it updated again. Well, let me clear it out. I really just want to show. Yeah, so it only does it the one time, and that's because there's only one set of logs that's happening outside of my function. I'm not actually using the function yet. So this code that you see here hasn't happened. Okay. There's a couple, there's one problem with this code in particular, but well, it's not actually a problem, but let's go ahead and worry about you know, one thing at a time. So the first thing we want to do is we want to change this variable reference. Currently, we're referring to this myname variable inside of our function. But what we're probably going to want to do is similar to console.log here. We're going to want to print, or we're going to want to produce the name that we set as our input. Now, this might not be clear yet because we haven't used the function, but if this is our input here, like the name of our input variable, we're going to want to use that and print it. If we want to truly, you know, replace this code here, that's still sort of, you know, duplicated. So what should happen now is basically, if I use this function print name, it's going to log the input name, and it's going to then log the following statements. And we should then be able to replace all of this code right here with just one line that calls print name with an input. So let's actually go ahead and try and do that. So I'm going to leave the definitions here of these two variables, my name and another name. And then I'm going to leave the definition of this function. And then what I'm going to do is actually use my function. So I'm going to say print name. I'm going to use parentheses, which is saying like, this is a reference to this function. And I'm now actually using the function by putting parentheses here. And then I'm going to input my to my function. Notice here that it actually still used my function. I wish there was a quick way for me to just press run. I know it's kind of weird to see me editing it just to get it to run, but yeah, just, I guess, kind of ignore that. You'll see that I get this keyword undefined. This happened because I actually didn't put anything into this function that's expecting an input here. And so what happened is it actually just printed the word undefined, meaning like, I don't know what an input name is. You didn't define it. So when I printed it, it didn't have a value to use. So it just printed undefined. But that's okay, because we're going to go ahead and update that. We're now going to use my name. And notice again, I'm outside of the function definition here. So the braces here, you can see how it's underlined this brace and this one. It's saying that this brace is paired with this one, meaning that everything inside of these braces is part of this function. So now I'm going to print an input name. Well, I'm not going to do that. That won't work because I don't have anything called input name yet. I could take this though, but I won't do that. I'll go ahead and use the variables I already have, right? Since they're conveniently here. So I'm going to replace this with my name. And now we should see, as we expect, right? Now it says Kenneth, because I defined Kenneth up here as a variable. I made a function that prints whatever you input, and then I called that function. And now, to kind of top everything off, we can do what we set out to do, which is basically take a bunch of code that took many lines to kind of produce. And now it only takes one line. So anytime we want to print a name with these statements, we can just use this function. And we'll get all of those statements. So now we get Kenneth, this is a name, what is yours? We get Alex, this is the name, what is yours? And we can even, we don't even have to use variables. We can just use strings straight away. So we can say, Bill or Nancy or something like that. And it knows what to do. It basically says, okay, an input name is now Nancy, and you want to print that, and you want to print these two other statements. And notice it will always print these two subsequent statements. And they come out the same every time because there's nothing variable, so to speak, about these statements. Okay, so that's how we use a function. This is a pretty, this is a pretty heavy concept in terms of being pretty complex when you start learning how to program. So, if you're still following along, that's really good, and you've hopefully learned something that is really useful and you can apply in other programming languages outside of just JavaScript. What I'd like to do now is, now that we have this function, we can use this function to do sort of simple tasks. specifically in the context of like the web or like a web page. And this is kind of like what JavaScript is all about. It's connecting your HTML, your web page content. So if you notice here, it says, my name is Kenneth. This is a little like printout of, it's like a render or view of the HTML that I have here. So it's basically taking this HTML and then building it as like a little mini web page. Similar, you know, just like a web page here, except this web page is like hosted at this website, whereas our web page is just all contained right on these little blocks. So one thing that I think could be pretty interesting is let's try to, if you notice, you know, we still have this function executing just one time every time we load the page. I mean, it's actually executing 3 times, but we had to be explicit about that. So we had to say, you know, print name, print name, print name, and it's going to do it all 3 times. So what I'd like to do is tie my code to this web page HTML right here, so that we can use the content that we're displaying on our web page to actually like make some of this code do some work for us. So the first thing to kind of get us on track to start doing that is to add, we're going to add a button. Now, this button isn't going to display below till we actually, and I'm just going to close that console for now. It's not going to do anything, or it's not even going to show up on our little page here until we actually add some text to the button. So let's say print name, because you know, I think we're going to tie this button to our function here so that hopefully we can get this button to actually print our name whenever we want. And you can see, you know, I added text inside of this button element, and then the button, you know, appeared on the page. So we're going to assign this button a type. And what that means is that a button is of type button. That sounds a bit silly, but if we don't give it this type, the button is going to assume that we're trying to use it with like a form. So like a form like you're probably very familiar with. So for example, can anyone think of like can we think of like a good form? So maybe, you know, order, like, I don't know why I'm trying to search for this, but maybe we can just look at an image. Well, we can always look at Wikipedia. So they'll probably, yeah. So something like you're probably really familiar with, like a form that looks like this, right? So it has like the name and some other options, and then you click a button to submit the form. So that's actually like the default behavior of a button is associated with a form. So we specified button because we just want our button to like be separate from anything like that. We want to control the functionality of our button. That might have been, you know, too much information, but I think it's kind of interesting to keep in mind. The next thing I want to do for a button is like we want to uniquely identify it. We use the attribute. This is an attribute, by the way, ID. We use the attribute ID to add this like identifier that we can use and reference in our JavaScript code. So this is the way that we're going to like find the button within our HTML from JavaScript. So I'm going to call this name printing button. So this is a long string, but this is like going to be the name of our button. And this is how we're going to find it in our JavaScript. So we're pretty much done with the HTML. You know, this is really simple, right? We just added a button, we gave it a type, and we gave it an ID. So now we're going to hop back over to the JavaScript. We're going to copy this ID And what we're going to do is go down below, and we're going to actually make a new function. Well, do we need? No, we don't need to make a new function because we already have our function here for printing. So I'm just going to use that. But we need to do a couple of things first to relate the execution of our JavaScript to this page code, this HTML. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define another variable. The variable I'm going to set up right now is I'm going to actually set up a variable that represents this button. And the way I'm going to do that is first of all, I'm going to call it name button. And again, this name doesn't refer to anything existing, like it's not special. I could have called it this. It wouldn't make any difference, just keep that in mind. And we're going to use a new API. Earlier I introduced the console API, which lets us log things. We're going to use a new API to essentially, I'm just going to make a comment here and say, we want to get a reference to the button in HTML. Okay. So we're going to use a new API, the document API. This document API is essentially going to let us access HTML elements and then reference them in our JavaScript. So I'm going to say document, just so similar to the way we use the console API, except I'm going to now use a new function that we haven't seen yet called get element by ID. And there's documentation for this, just like there's documentation for the console API. If we take a look at web APIs, which I'll close this, we don't need that open. I think it should be listed here. Yeah, technically it's I think it should be, oops. I take a look, yeah, so we can see document here. I'll just use this. So document here is a really similar to console. It has a bunch of functions that you can use related to your HTML or your like the content of your document. This would be called a document. This below, like the result of all of our HTML code would be our document here. So I'm going to use this special function that's provided by document called get element by ID. And hopefully you can kind of imagine what this is going to do just by the name, which is good. It's going to get an element by its ID. So I'm going to give it an ID. And remember, I copied it earlier. I'm going to put quotes around it because it's expecting a string, just like this function. And I'm going to say, okay, name printing button. So I'm going to use my ID, which I set earlier. I'm going to go fetch a reference to this button. And I'm going to do one final thing. This part is, I think, a little more complicated, but it's also just one line of code. So I think it's still useful to understand, or at least just to see. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm now going to tie everything together. So what I'm going to say is name button dot on click. Okay, so what on click is on click is a function similar to like log, similar to get element by ID. But it's actually a function that belongs to name button in a way. It's more of like an event, but it's an event that is watched. It's an event that is watched or like handled just as part of our document. And what I'm going to do is say, I'm gonna use my function here. Hold on. I'm just going to leave that as is.
Do you have to evaluate each line of code before, or to like make it exist? I guess is the, I don't know quite how to phrase this question, but I mean, you had to evaluate the HTML line, right? And then you also had to evaluate the JavaScript line.
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. Yeah, I think, yeah, in this case, if we were doing this in our own environment, like if we were, for example, like doing this on our own computer, we would have to, excuse me, like specify when the JavaScript loads, as in like, when does this code execute? Does it execute before my HTML content, or does it execute after my HTML content loads? It seems in this case, I wonder if we can like see or like specify this. I don't know if we can say whether that's the case, but it looks like to me that essentially the JavaScript is waiting for the HTML to finish loading, and then the JavaScript will run. But that is a good question, because in this case, yeah, we need the HTML that we've written here. We need this button to exist before we can reference it by its name. So we're saying name printing button, get element by ID. We need to make sure that that element is there before we can actually use the name button to set up like an event. So in particular, this on-click event. This wouldn't work if the button didn't exist yet. So that is a good question. Yeah.
But you could nest the name button in with the let function, or do they have to be separate? Or let isn't a function, it's the API.
This part
right?
here?
Yeah, line 12.
Yeah, this part is, it's a little bit, we could kind of do it like this, if it would make it look. What we're doing is essentially, we are making a new variable. The variable is basically a reference to a special structure that we get when we look up our ID here. The structure isn't like, it's not like I'm getting some HTML code when I do this, but I'm getting basically a JavaScript representation of this button. That sounds a little bit weird. But for now, you can just think of it like, you know, give me the button, and then when you click the button, do this. And for simplicity's sake, what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to remove this parameter for now from our function. And I'll just get rid of it here. And actually, I'm just going to get rid of this reference just to make things very, very simple. So what I'll have it do instead is just print my name. This constant here, we can refer to this constant above. And okay, and then we can see that it prints everything as we expect. So instead of inputting the name now, what I'm doing is I'm just referencing the constant that we made earlier. That's always going to be there from inside of my function, so that it just always prints the same name every time, just for simplicity's sake. But so to kind of bring it back to like, what is this? This, when we say let name button, name button is what's called an object. Hadn't really introduced objects yet because they're a little bit complicated, but I think it's good to introduce functions first. If you kind of understand what a function's doing, you know, this is doing like a task. But in JavaScript, you do have this concept of like objects, and nearly everything that you use in JavaScript, even variables in some way are what are called like objects. It's not super important just for understanding, you know, sort of like what this does, but if you want to understand, you know, kind of the under workings of like, you know, what is document, what is name button? Well, they're objects. They're special objects that have properties and functions that they have access to. And what we're actually doing here is, instead of using, and I think this may actually need to be made clear, because I think I kind of brushed over it, and maybe this is a point of confusion too, but when I'm saying name button dot on click equals, I'm not calling like this on click function like I'm doing here, or you know, I'm not doing that. What I'm actually doing is I'm making an assignment similar to the way I'm doing this here. So what I'm actually saying is, just like in this case, you know, I'm saying my name equals Kenneth. What I'm saying is the on click event or this function for name button, I want you to use print name. So when on click happens, basically when I click, use the function that I made, which is print name. If we get rid of this line, because of the button type, nothing happens. Well, it looks like something is happening, but it's actually not, right? Like nothing happens when I click this. That's because we haven't assigned a function for onClick. I hope the example isn't too complicated. I more just want to demonstrate sort of what JavaScript is capable of. You know, we can take our HTML code and we can relate it using JavaScript, so that we can have code that executes like sort of on command from our web page. I think hopefully that this is like legible to a degree, but
Yeah,
it is. Oh, okay, good. That's good.
What's like the word you use or the language you use to say that the JavaScript is connected to the HTML? Like line 9, I guess. Like what? Does that make sense? Like what is like referencing the HTML? Like the JavaScript is referencing the HTML,
that's a great question.
Calling it, or what do you?
No, yeah, that's a good question. So what is actually happening here is we're using an API that's part of the web browser to manipulate what's called manipulating the document. In this case, what's happened before is just as important as like what's happening right now. What's happened before with this JavaScript code, like before this code began executing, is we had our HTML document load. And what the browser did is it actually built a special model of like what our document contained. So it said, okay, like I know that this document has a paragraph, and that paragraph has this content value. And I know it has a button, and that button has this ID, and it has this content value. In our JavaScript, what we're actually doing is we're using an API, the document API, to reference this model of like our HTML. So it's kind of like saying having like a dictionary or like an encyclopedia or something that's really specific to just our HTML code. And it's like saying, hey, like, do you have something called name printing button. And so it serves this back and says like, yeah, I do. I have this object, like I said before, an object that I have ready just for you based on your document called name printing button. And it has certain properties. Now, what we're doing here is we're kind of like guessing at those properties. I happen to know that this has an on-click property. We can read about the on-click property here. It's called a click event. And click event is on most elements. We're actually using the event handler, which is on click. So we're basically letting a function take the place of our event handler. That's a little over, I mean, if you dug more into JavaScript, you could start to learn about that. That's kind of how we're interfacing with. So maybe I'd say that way, if you're asking for a particular word, I'm interfacing with the HTML, but I'm doing so only because the browser built, like when it loaded our page, it was like, okay, let me quickly like kind of put together this thing that represents for your JavaScript, like your HTML that you've written. And then we can use it to interact with it. Does that make sense?
I think so. So like when you load a web page, it's loading the HTML file, but then it's also loading all the JavaScript
Yes.
as well.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so therefore, denser web pages take longer to load.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. There's other factors with slow loading web pages too. Sometimes we might load things from other places and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely if you have a lot of JavaScript on your page.
But the API already exists within the browser.
Yes, it's almost like kind of a requirement actually that a browser, if they want to meet, we can go here. Well, maybe we could. Oh, wait, here we go. Yeah, so if I go to browser compatibility, you can see here sort of. So first of all, you can see the function actually. This is pretty cool. So here's the document API, right? So, oh wow. I'm on the document web API, right? And if we go down to browser compatibility, it'll actually tell me all of the browsers that support that method that I just used, or that function, which was get element by ID. And you can see here this whole row is in fact green. That's because every sort of like modern browser is going to support that function. It's just so common. But you can see that some browsers, they decide not to support certain things. It's kind of up to them to do that. It's in their best interest to support it. But they certainly don't have to. If we look at something like Chrome, for example. Speaking of which, well, I'll just mention this really quick, but Chrome, they've chosen not to support certain things where maybe some other browsers do. So it just depends, actually. But yeah, I think that's about time now. Hopefully I've introduced you to something that's, pretty exciting. I mean, now we know we can basically write HTML, build a simple page, and we can call JavaScript from our page using like certain events on the page. There's all kinds of events too, like clicking, blur or focus, where like if I hover, I can call JavaScript on hover. I can, there's tons of different ways to call JavaScript using this event system. So yeah, hopefully that was a helpful lesson, and I hope to see everyone next time.
I had a question.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
So I thought normally when you call a function, you have to have the parentheses. that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
But
I
then on
kind
the
of,
on click, I
Mhm.
noticed that you didn't have the parentheses.
right.
Is there a
Yeah.
difference there?
Yes, there is a difference there. And that was a really good catch because I should talk about that as well. So just like how I was saying before, what I'm actually doing here, I'm not, like with this statement, I'm not calling a function like I'm doing here. What I'm doing is I'm making an assignment. So I'm saying, similar to what I did here, my name equals Kenneth. What I'm saying is on click equals, and I'm assigning this function to this sort of like, the way that the documentation put it, they called it an event handler. So it's an event handler. Because of that, I don't want to call the function, because if I did that, I'm not even sure what would happen. Does it just still work? It just does nothing. I guess I assume basically it just, since this function doesn't, we didn't really talk about functions that return things, but I could write a function that actually gives me something back. I didn't do that, so by calling this function, I'm saying that the event handler is now, nothing. So I guess it just continues to do what it already did, which is basically do nothing when we click this button. So when I don't use the parentheses, what I'm doing is I'm saying, use this function. Use this function that I'm referencing by name, print name. Use it to handle this event. So it's an assignment similar to how I assigned this variable here.
So is the click calling it though, or?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. So when I click now, what happens is it says, okay, what should happen when the user clicks? And it will say, okay, well, they clicked the name button. Oh, I actually have some JavaScript that needs to run when someone does that. And it says, oh, that JavaScript is actually the function print name. So I need to run that function right now. And that's what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know this stuff is like definitely, we jumped, like we made a very large stride with this lesson, but I think it's very good to like, demonstrate just how powerful this is, like how we can now like make web pages that actually do things, do tasks for us.